Now it's time for this hour's news review. Well, Russia has renewed its warning to the West about supplying F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. Moscow says providing Kiev with the warplanes would bring up the question of NATO's involvement in the ongoing conflict. The Russian ambassador to Washington sounded the alarm that the advanced American fighter jets may end up bombing targets belonging to Russia. Anatoly Antonov pointed to Russian-controlled Crimea, where Kiev has stepped up its attacks. Antonov said any Ukrainian strike on Crimea would be regarded as a strike on Russia. On Saturday, Moscow cautioned that Western countries would suffer colossal risk if they offer the warplanes to Ukraine. Now, that after the U.S. gave a green light to its allies to supply Kiev with fighter jets and allowed training programs for Ukrainian pilots. Washington had for months expressed its reluctance to send the planes to Kiev, citing numerous reasons. Well, I'd like to welcome my guests to this news review. Out of Moscow, Press TV's Johnny Miller. And out of Sweden, Greg Simons, researcher, Institute for Russian and Eurasian Studies. Thank you both for being with me. Johnny, starting off with you, tell us about this. Lines are definitely seeming that they're getting close to being crossed, if not having been crossed already. So here we have NATO, these Western countries now providing basically whatever they can to Russia, to Ukraine against Russia. And Russia's saying they better be careful because they're kind of getting the lines blurred. Tell us your take about all of this, Johnny.
Well, this is just another layer on the snowball, if you like, that's rolling and getting bigger and heading to a very dangerous place. This announcement of F-16 fighter planes is another escalation. The problem for Russia as well, though, is, and there's been some high-profile Russian figures as well who've spoken about this, that every time the NATO does send more powerful weaponry to Ukraine, recently, of course, the United Kingdom sending cruise missiles, Storm Shadow cruise missiles, Russia puts out statements saying, well, you're getting close to the red line here. And every time NATO does this, Russia puts out another statement saying you're getting close to the red line, but NATO keeps pushing. So there's a lot of criticism on the Russian side as well, saying that, well, at some point, Russia is going to have to do something about this. But it's another escalation where these F-16 planes, I certainly hope they'll be taking off from Ukraine. It's also difficult for them to take off Ukraine. They might be targets, sitting ducks when they're on the ground. I certainly hope they won't be taking off from other countries. Then the whole world should be very fearful about potential consequences. But we're seeing this consistent escalation from NATO. You also have to ask questions about have pilots been trained already? Has this announcement been made and preparations already been made beforehand? So it's another dangerous escalation. And it's one of the reasons that other countries around the world who aren't necessarily involved in Ukraine are very worried about this. China, or Brazil, of course, various other countries, so probably most countries around the world, are very concerned about the continued escalation in Ukraine because it does threaten not just Russia and Ukraine and Europe, but the entire world.
Indeed, and quite frightening. Greg, your take on all this, are we inching closer to a global war? And how is it, if we look at NATO, on the one hand, they're providing everything they can, basically, now to Ukraine, but are quite critical and mindful if any country says that they are helping Russia or helping give supplies or military equipment to Russia. Your take on all of this?
Well, the US is getting quite desperate because they're not getting the results they expected. I mean, if you go back in the history of warfare, they have done what the Western Allies thought of Ottoman Empire in the First World War. They underestimated its skill and its resolve in warfare. And this creates a problem because they keep on escalating. Now, Russia, unlike the West, when they draw red lines, they keep them. And this creates a lot of uncertainty. Also, if we think about it, the US is not only hypocritical, but it's absolutely vulnerable because what few people in the West know, that currently, as it stands, the US occupies more of Syria, stealing its oil and grain, than Russia controls of Ukraine. So, if they start supplying weapons of higher grade, what will be the constraints or restraints on Russia supplying all the different forces seeking to expel the US invaders and occupiers in Syria and other places around the world? I mean, it creates the context for a legitimate escalation, but a dangerous escalation. And I mean, people in Europe, I mean, the political leaders are absolute slaves to the US. I mean, they have no will of their own, but the people are developing a will and an understanding that their lifestyle and security is extremely at risk because their leaders are following the US into an abyss.
Well, I mean, Johnny, when we look at what is happening right now, I mean, it kind of reminds me, going back to the 90s and, of course, when the whole situation with NATO and Russia started saying, just don't come to the east. And, of course, they kept saying they wouldn't. And they continued and continued and continued until the whole situation happened with Ukraine. Do you feel that this is a similar situation now, that NATO is pushing and pushing and pushing, and will it push as far as it can go until Russia may not have any other possibility but having to respond to NATO directly?
Well, yeah, anybody who seriously understands international politics knows perfectly well that NATO has played a large role in provoking this conflict. That's understood, except the huge propaganda campaign that tries to pretend that isn't the case. But what many have hoped is that at some point, when it's been clear that Ukraine is not going to be able to take back these 4 regions, there will be some kind of peace settlement, particularly as the European economy continues to suffer. But it seems that every possible off-ramp moment, NATO continues to ramp up its support for Ukraine. And you're also seeing, it's interesting, Seymour Hersh's reports, because he's quoting people inside the American establishment saying that the Americans blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. There's a lot of people see increasing interviews with certain establishment figures in the United States or previous establishment figures in the military, etc., who are taking the same criticism, taking the same line, criticizing NATO's policy. So I think there is many people in the elites in NATO who are really questioning whether this is the right policy to go down, continued escalation, because there's a desperation amongst many of these elites to try and defeat Russia. There's a growing war between the West and the East, between NATO, between the West with Iran, of course, and China and Russia, and they're really trying their best to try and defeat Russia in Ukraine, and they're going to take it all the way to the line. And all the way to the line is a very dangerous place. And if we continue down this course, there's only one. The danger to the world increases at every step. Right. So at one point, somebody's going to have to blink. But it looks like NATO is still going to continue as far as it can.
Well, what about that, Greg? Actually, that brings me to my next question, because you said that basically NATO, Europeans are basically slaves to the Americans. For how long? I mean, how long can they do this we see what's happening in these European countries. We see what has happened to, for example, Germany, where even the pipeline was blown up and so many things, but still they're continuing on. Do you agree with Johnny that perhaps there may be a breaking point for NATO or for these European countries to say enough is enough and stop being a slave of Washington? Or your assessment of that?
Well, I mean, you do get some isolated instances at this stage of criticism of the US. Of course, you've got utter slaves like Schultz, who's an utter disgrace, how he behaves. He behaves like a school child in front of a principal. And what you have here, I mean, those people who still have some kind of cognitive ability understand how dangerous this is getting. Okay, they supplied them some armoured vehicles, and so today when we had those cross-border raids, which Ukraine went into Russian territory as a means to try and get some form of leverage to negotiate, presumably, they were using Western vehicles. But they don't supply the Western military equipment with the latest technology. And there are, I think, two main reasons for this. One of them is if the Russians capture it, then of course NATO secrets come out. And I mean, they're already understanding how to fight NATO just by the ground operations. But more importantly, I mean, Ukraine has been selling weapons to the highest bidder. They've been buying them. Even Russia has been buying the latest French self-propelled artillery systems. So, I mean, they understand that Ukraine, it's a matter of time before it goes down. So it's a matter of knowing when to fold. And you've got the military people and some analysts who are already getting cold feet and saying this is well and truly beyond time. But then you're getting those political ones who are ideologically driven, and they're also driven by this geopolitical idea that the US is this indispensable country and all of this ideological garbage that they believe in. And so they have no common sense, and they will continue to push it. The US and NATO are somewhat like little children who've never been told no, and they're being told no now. So it's a question of will enough people wake up to stop this trend, or will it just continue like what happened from June to August 1914, but with much more serious consequences? At this stage, I can't answer that. I mean, there is a wealth of idiots in positions of power, unfortunately, in the West.
All right. And on that note, I appreciate both of you being with me on this news review. Johnny Miller, Press TV's correspondent out of Moscow, and Greg Simons, Research Institute for Russia and Eurasian Studies out of Sweden. And thank you, viewers, for being with us on another news review.